All the screens went red at the exact same time. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was the catastrophic, synchronized death of a system failing from the inside out, dropping the entire global grid before any individual node even had time to log the error and try to compensate. 1 second. Dozens of high-res monitors were streaming the live navigation data of a massive shipping fleet scattered across the Pacific Ocean. The next second, solid red, bleeding red across every single terminal, and underneath that red, the blaring klaxon alarm that IT analysts trained their entire careers praying they never actually hear outside of a simulation. That highly specific guttural siren that doesn't just mean warning, it means the heart has stopped beating. The control room collapsed into a state of panic that perfectly mirrored the system failure. 20-something whiz kids who had been hired purely for their keyboard speed and fluency in modern protocols were scrambling from station to station with that terrifying blind urgency that happens when you're moving fast, but have absolutely no idea where you're going, because knowing where to go implies you understand the problem. And the problem currently nuking their servers was exactly what every modern disaster protocol had failed to predict. Voices were violently overlapping. The kernel is dead. The core process flatlined. It didn't even drop a crash log. The backup is down too. The mirror server is throwing a fatal consistency error. Can anybody get root access? Anybody? We've completely lost telemetry on the Pacific Fleet. Every single vessel just defaulted to emergency autonomous mode. Dead center in that chaos stood a man who had woken up that morning blissfully unaware that today was the day he would discover the terrifying oceanic gap between what he thought he knew and what he actually needed to know to survive. 30 years old, wearing a bespoke designer suit that cost more than 2 months' salary for anyone else in that room. His hair styled with the kind of expensive product that holds everything perfectly in place no matter what happens on the outside, which was ironic considering what was currently happening to him on the inside. Raphael Drummond Jr. was death gripping a desk phone, his knuckles turning white, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to project the alpha dog authority he had learned by watching his father, an authority he had never actually needed to use in a real firefight. What do you mean, perishable cargo? His voice spiked an octave higher than he wanted, leaking the raw panic the commanding tone was supposed to hide. We are talking about thousands of shipping containers, poultry, soy, biopharma, cargo that requires active temperature control. If they sit dead in the water out in the Pacific without a reroute, they are going to rot in the middle of the ocean. I am telling you, we are looking at tens of millions of dollars in total losses. A pause, where he clearly heard an answer he didn't want to hear. Find me a goddamn solution right now. That is what you people are paid for. He slammed the phone down onto the desk with an impact that launched 2 heavy pens onto the floor. He buried his face in his hands. My father is going to kill me, he whispered to absolutely no one, his voice muffled by his palms. The company is going to go bankrupt, and my father is going to kill me. It wasn't an emotional exaggeration. It was the frantic, jagged math of a guy who understood the financials just well enough to know that if this system failure wasn't resurrected in the next few hours, it would trigger a catastrophic domino effect. It would start with the rotting cargo, bleed into the breached supply contracts, detonate their credit lines, and permanently destroy the name of the empire his grandfather had built, his father had expanded, and that he had simply inherited fully assembled. And tonight, he had finally hit the absolute limit of everything he had inherited, without ever understanding how it was actually built. Outside the glass walls of the control room, standing perfectly still in the hallway, was a figure. A 70-year-old man who had clocked into the night shift at that corporation the exact same way he had for years, walking from the bus stop 3 blocks away, wearing a faded khaki uniform that had been washed so many times. It had surrendered its original color but stubbornly held its shape. He held his uniform cap in his hand because he had learned a long time ago that wearing a hat indoors created a specific kind of blue-collar invisibility that wasn't always convenient. He had a pronounced limp. His right leg had been mangled in a car wreck over 20 years ago, an accident that had violently altered the trajectory of his life in ways he was still, from time to time, discovering. The limp had eventually just become part of his natural rhythm. Not exactly a limitation anymore, just a characteristic, like the specific cadence a body develops when it finally negotiates a permanent truce with its own center of gravity. His name was Antonio. On the corporate payroll, he was listed as Antonio Silva, night watchman, tenure 4 years. He was watching the meltdown through the glass with that heavy, grounded expression, that people who have survived the worst the world has to offer eventually develop, not the apathy of someone who doesn't care, but the deep, stabilizing calm of a man who possesses enough historical context to place the current apocalypse exactly where it belongs in the grand scheme of things. His hand slipped into the inside breast pocket of his uniform. His rough fingers found the notebook by pure muscle memory, the worn black leather cover, the slightly rusted spiral binding that groaned when you flipped it open, the pages that had been meticulously filled over the years with tiny, architectural handwriting that looked absolutely nothing like the lazy scrawl of a guy just taking notes. It was the handwriting of a man who writes because his brain physically demands the paper, because there are certain equations that only stabilize once they leave the skull and lock onto a physical surface. Antonio stood frozen in the hallway with the notebook in his pocket for a long moment. Then he took one slow step toward the glass door. But to understand exactly what was buried in those pages, and what kind of fire was burning in the eyes of a man watching an empire burn with more clarity than the men running it, we need to rewind the clock a few weeks. We need to go back to the graveyard shifts nobody ever saw, the silent hours that only exist in the shadow world after the executives go home. The global headquarters of Drummond Logistics dominated an 8-story glass monolith in a port district that had been aggressively gentrified over the last decade, fueled by the kind of massive capital injections that literally rewrite the geography of a city. The building was an imposing shell of glass and steel, designed with that specific corporate architecture, meant to broadcast brutal solidity and relentless forward momentum. A building screaming to the world that the empire inside it owned the present and was actively conquering the future. Antonio knew every single hallway in that monolith by the exact friction of the floor tiles under his boots. He had taken the night watchman gig 4 years ago, surfacing after a dark, grinding period of his life that he never spoke about, mostly because nobody in that building ever bothered to ask, and because he had learned the hard way that the world is in absolutely no rush to hear the backstory of a guy who takes a security job at 66. He walked his patrol routes with the mechanical reliability of a Swiss watch, not the lazy, box-checking routine of a guy just running out the clock, but the hyper-vigilant rhythm of a man who had deeply internalized the acoustic baseline of the building, a man who would detect a microscopic shift in that rhythm before his brain even gave it a name. During those patrols, he would stop. He had highly specific checkpoints where he lingered, not because his bad leg demanded a break, but because those were the coordinates where there was actual data to observe. The server farm, where the LED arrays pulsed in a chaotic rhythm he had learned to diagnose like a doctor reading an EKG. The massive data corridor housing the fleet monitoring terminals, where the sleeping displays broadcasted, to anyone smart enough to decode the matrix, the raw operational health of the company's entire global navigation and logistics grid. Antonio knew exactly how to read the matrix. The black notebook had started innocently enough as a simple log, jotted observations about the system architecture he watched humming in the dark, recurring data patterns, microscopic operational anomalies that popped up frequently enough to demand documentation. But over the agonizingly slow months, the notebook mutated into something else entirely. It became a sanctuary, a quarantine zone where a terrifyingly brilliant mind that had been violently forced into silence for 2 decades slowly began to spool back up to its natural, terrifying velocity. The pages of that notebook were bleeding with numbers and complex flow diagrams that were absolutely not the 5th grade math an arrogant kid had called them, on a night he would never forget. They were algorithms, not in the casual buzzword sense, in the brutal, technically flawless formal language of a man who had spent his prime years dissecting predictive logistics models with the god-tier depth of an architect who doesn't just use the software, but writes the physics engine underneath it. Buried deep in those pages was the exact, elegant solution to a catastrophic cancer the company had. A cancer nobody on the payroll had even flagged as a symptom yet. A lethal vulnerability buried deep inside the failover protocol. A flaw that, under a highly specific simultaneous global load stress, would cause the billion-dollar backup servers to violently crash in the exact same millisecond the primary kernel failed. Antonio had hunted down and isolated that exact vulnerability 6 weeks ago. He had mapped the kill chain in his notebook. He had engineered the patch. He had gone back to walking his rounds. And one night, he had actually tried to warn them. It happened on a random Tuesday afternoon when Raphael Drummond Jr. had blown into headquarters completely off schedule. He had rolled in straight off his yacht, carrying that toxic, buzzing energy of a guy who just spent a 3-day weekend in a place that pours $500 bottles of liquor. A guy operating under the delusion that his lingering buzz is actually productive executive energy. He had crossed paths with Antonio in the main corridor, right next to the sleeping monitoring terminals. Antonio had stopped him. He had politely stated he needed to report a critical anomaly regarding the mainframe architecture. Raphael had looked at him the exact same way he looked at the cleaning staff, the maintenance crew, and anyone else who didn't officially exist on his radar, like a camera lens auto-focusing to register a physical obstacle, without ever actually registering a human being. "Make it fast, old man. I have a board meeting." Antonio had started to brief him. He had started breaking down the failover protocol, the specific load stress pattern he had identified, the catastrophic window of vulnerability he had meticulously mapped out in the black notebook. He had spoken for maybe 40 seconds before he realized Raphael was actively scrolling through his phone. "I don't understand a single word coming out of your mouth." Raphael had shoved his phone into his tailored pocket with a dismissive, slashing gesture that was, in itself, a complete termination of the conversation. "You're the security guard, right? Then guard the damn doors. Leave the systems engineering to the people who actually went to college for it." And he had strutted down the hallway without looking back. Antonio had stood frozen in the corridor, the notebook gripped tight in his calloused hand. He had gone back to his patrol. The night Raphael had rolled back into headquarters, visibly altered from another yacht party, and found Antonio sitting on a bench in the service corridor sketching in the notebook by flashlight, happened exactly 3 weeks after that first encounter. The sequence of violence that played out that night carried that highly specific, lazy cruelty that requires absolutely zero premeditation, because it's always fully loaded and ready to fire. The default weapon of a predator who has been taught from birth that he can abuse the invisible class with zero consequences. "Still awake, cripple?" The words hit the hallway with a sneering, casual tone that is infinitely uglier than a scream, because it broadcasts that the cruelty required absolutely no emotional effort. "Doodling little pictures in the dark? You should be down on your knees thanking God my family gave a charity job to a cripple who can barely walk." He had violently snatched the notebook right out of Antonio's hands. He had aggressively flipped through the pages with the dismissive, blinding speed of a guy looking for an excuse to mock, not looking to read. Pages upon pages of dense, predictive algorithms and architectural diagrams that were, to a guy who had paid people to take his college exams, just random scribbles that perfectly confirmed the arrogant verdict he had reached before he even opened the cover. "What is this garbage, 5th grade math?" A brutal, theatrical pause, flashing that toxic, shark-like smile that has absolutely nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the sadistic thrill of public humiliation. "I bet you don't even know how to spell logarithm, do you? Stay in your lane, old man, and keep this trash out of my sight." He threw the notebook onto the linoleum floor. It hit with that dull, hollow smack of a priceless object being treated like garbage by a hand that doesn't understand what it's holding. Antonio had stayed seated on the bench for one heavy second. Then he had slowly pushed himself up, fighting the grinding, agonizing friction of being 70 years old with a right leg that refused to bend properly. He had bent down with that exact same grinding effort, and he had picked his notebook up off the floor. He had brushed his rough hand over the black leather cover. Not a dramatic, cinematic gesture, but the quiet, dignified reflex of a man who fiercely protects what he builds because he knows exactly what it's worth, regardless of the price tag some arrogant kid puts on it. He had slid it back into his inside pocket, and he had continued his patrol. It is physically sickening to believe that someone can look dead in the eyes of another human being. A man who has survived 70 years of grinding reality, who is literally carrying the salvation of that arrogant kid's entire empire in his front pocket, and see absolutely nothing but a faded uniform and a crippled leg. If you feel the heat of that injustice burning in your gut, smash that like button right now to prove you're standing with Antonio. Because the catastrophic vulnerability Antonio had meticulously documented 6 weeks ago was detonating tonight. The failover protocol had violently crashed the exact millisecond the primary kernel flatlined, exactly the way he had mapped it, exactly under the load stress conditions he had predicted, and triggering the exact apocalyptic consequences he had calculated. Thousands of rotting shipping containers drifting blindly in the Pacific, an arrogant heir weeping into his hands, a multi-million-dollar control room full of prodigies running around like terrified children, and standing right outside the glass doors, a 70-year-old man with a black notebook tucked inside his faded khaki uniform, who had just taken one slow step forward, and was, in this exact moment, wrapping his scarred hand around the door handle. The notebook held the cure. It had held the cure for 6 weeks. The meltdown officially kicked off at 11:14 p.m., not with an explosion, but with a terrifying silence. The highly specific, vacuum-like silence that deep systems create when they stop answering pings. It's fundamentally different from normal silence because normal silence is just the absence of noise, but this silence was the absence of a heartbeat. The sudden, terrifying absence of the steady, rhythmic pulse of telemetry data that had been flowing into that room for so long it had become invisible. Like the oxygen in the air. Only noticed the second it's gone. The first junior analyst to catch the flatline stared at his monitor for 2 full, agonizing seconds, before his brain would even allow him to process the reality of what he was looking at. Then he hissed at the guy next to him. Then that guy yelled for the shift supervisor. And the shift supervisor snapped his head up to the master situational board, the massive wall of monitors that was supposed to be tracking the live, pinpoint coordinates of every single vessel in the Drummond fleet across the globe. And he saw exactly what Antonio had predicted he would see 6 weeks ago, inside a notebook that had been thrown on the floor by hands too stupid to know what they were throwing away. The primary kernel had died. Not the flashy user interface, not the front-end dashboard. The kernel. The absolute bedrock. The central processing core that had been grinding away 24/7 for 40 straight years, buried under layers of legacy code written by ghosts, engineers who had retired, moved on, or died. Men who had built that foundational architecture back when the cargo ships it was tracking belonged to a completely different technological era. 4 decades of band-aid patches, duct tape updates, and forced adaptations had been slathered over that original core like 50 coats of cheap paint over a rotting load-bearing wall. The wall was still technically holding the house up, but nobody had dared to look directly at it in years. The automated backup had desperately tried to catch the falling knife, and it had instantly snapped its own neck the exact millisecond the primary died, for the exact mathematical reason Antonio had documented. A microscopic, lethal window of vulnerability where the 2 massive systems, the dying primary and the booting backup, generated a violent access conflict that spawned a fatal consistency error, instantly bricking them both simultaneously. A window of milliseconds that the corporate engineers had dismissed as theoretically improbable, but had just happened in the real world because the exact cocktail of conditions required to trigger it was present tonight, fueled by the specific cargo load, ambient temperatures, and vessel classes that the Black Notebook had already factored into the equation. Hundreds of massive ships. Superclass container ships, bulk freighters, specialized refrigerated transports, the absolute lifeblood of one of the most dominant maritime logistics empires on the continent, scattered blindly across the Pacific, the South Atlantic, the Panama Canal, and the Strait of Malacca. Every single one of them had violently defaulted into emergency autonomous mode. The fail-safe protocol the onboard navigation computers trigger when they go deaf and blind to central command. The protocol drops anchor and holds the ship in a safe holding pattern, but it absolutely refuses to accept reroutes. It refuses to adjust cruising speeds for the dying perishable cargo. It refuses to do anything but sit dead in the water and wait for God to call. And waiting, with thousands of tons of frozen poultry, volatile soy, and temperature-critical pharmaceuticals baking in the holds, carried a financial bleed rate that the analysts were starting to calculate with the sickening, terrified speed of guys watching a ticking bomb they can't defuse. The senior software engineers had swarmed the building less than 30 minutes after the red alert dropped. The guys already on rotation hit the floor instantly, while the off-duty heavy hitters were dragged out of bed by the kind of screaming emergency phone calls you instantly recognize as the ones that end careers at 11 o'clock at night. There were 6 of them huddled around the master terminals now, root admin access wide open, the raw system crash logs vomiting across the monitors in a dense, chaotic matrix of text that looked like alien scripture to a civilian. And the horrifying truth was, it only looked partially readable to them, because the dead kernel had been coded in a primitive language that very few modern programmers were fluent in anymore, utilizing an architectural style that was considered bleeding edge in the 1980s, but was now an ancient, archaic dialect that the young prodigies could translate, but absolutely could not speak. The lead systems engineer was a guy named Marcus, 38 years old, armed with a master's in distributed software architecture, carrying a bulletproof resume that included a 2-year tour at a massive American logistics firm and a ridiculously expensive European certification that had been worth every single penny in the climb that brought him to this exact chair. Marcus was staring into the bleeding heart of the crash with the terrified eyes of a guy who understands complex systems better than anyone, and just realized he is staring at a monster infinitely more complex than he has the time or the tools to kill. "I tried to force restart the primary process," he barked at the senior dev next to him, his eyes glued to the scrolling code. The process actually spins up. It initiates the boot sequence. It hits the load point for the root optimization module, and it violently bricks. Every single time. Exact same choke point. Is the mirror server bricking there too? The backup doesn't even make it that far. It fatal errors on initialization, consistency mismatch in the state database. It's like it's desperately trying to load a saved state that's already been deleted from reality. Can we nuke the state database and cold boot from zero? If we cold boot from zero, we permanently wipe every active route in the fleet. The ships wouldn't know where the hell to go even if we managed to re-establish the uplink. The rapid-fire dialogue carried that highly specific, clinical quality of engineers fighting a war. Ruthlessly efficient, zero wasted breath, but absolutely dripping with a radioactive undercurrent of panic that didn't need to be spoken out loud because it was screaming in every half-second of silence between the words. Raphael Drummond Jr. had finally pulled his face out of his hands and was now hovering right behind the engineers, striking a pose he'd been taught to call executive supervision, but which was, in brutal reality, the pathetic stance of a guy who has absolutely no idea what is happening, but is terrified that standing further away makes him look even weaker. The red numbers on the massive side monitor kept spinning upward, projected hourly losses, a column that refused to stop bleeding. Raphael stared at the hemorrhage with the hollow expression of a kid who had been spoon-fed the myth his entire life that his father's empire was a bulletproof, apex predator, and was discovering in real time that apex predators have exposed jugulars that nobody bothers to guard because they arrogantly assume nothing is brave enough to bite them. And this is where we have to freeze the frame for a second, because there is a profound cosmic joke playing out in that control room. The elite strike team of engineers, the lead dev with the bulletproof resume, the billionaire heir who arrogantly believed that inheriting the keys to the logistics empire meant he actually understood the engines that drove it. All of them, packed together with all their Ivy League degrees, their six-figure salaries, and their God mode admin passwords, were staring blankly at a puzzle they could not solve. And the master key to that exact puzzle had been available for 6 weeks, written in pencil inside a black notebook, tucked into the pocket of a faded security uniform. If you appreciate the heavy, poetic justice of that irony, crush that like button right now to show you're riding with Antonio. The heavy glass door clicked open. Nobody noticed the breach immediately. The room was boiling with enough chaotic movement that a single body slipping through the door didn't register on the radar of guys who were hyper-focused on the burning monitors. Antonio walked into the room with the measured, deliberate stride he had forged over 4 years of walking those exact floors in the dead of night. The stride of a man who knows the topography of the room so intimately, he doesn't need to look down at his boots. A walk that radiated a deep, unshakable familiarity with the space. He navigated the shortest, most direct line through the chaos straight to the command console where Marcus was bleeding out over the keyboard, the black notebook already pulled from his pocket, and flipped open to the exact page he had mapped out 6 weeks ago. Marcus's eyes were locked on the crash log when the voice hit his ear. The glitch isn't in the new patch. Antonio's voice carried that highly specific, terrifyingly calm frequency that is impossible to fake. It wasn't the arrogant, forced calm of a guy trying to look tough. It was the absolute stabilizing calm of a man who had completely solved the equation before he ever opened the door, and was just arriving to deliver the answer. Every single word dropped with the perfect amount of space around it, completely devoid of panic, completely devoid of hesitation. It's the 40-year-old legacy kernel. A tactical pause deployed for clinical precision, not dramatic effect. The real-time route optimization variable is violently conflicting with the deadweight tonnage restrictions hard-coded for the new 5th-generation container ships. The original algorithm was absolutely never designed to calculate for vessels with that massive of a displacement. When the fleet started deploying the Gen 5s, the deadweight integer blew right past the maximum ceiling the kernel was architected to handle, and the core started spawning micro-conflicts that finally cascaded into a critical mass tonight. Marcus slowly turned his head. The look on his face in that exact moment was a violent collision of emotions that are never supposed to share the same real estate. Pure shock, aggressive disbelief, and buried right underneath both of them, that electric, involuntary spark that engineers get when they hear a completely insane hypothesis that their gut instantly recognizes as the missing puzzle piece, before their logical brain even has time to run the math. Then, the corporate survival instinct violently overrode the spark. "Get the hell away from my desk," his voice snapped out, wielding the rigid, aggressive authority that terrified men use as a shield. Marcus's eyes raked over the faded khaki uniform, the cheap cap clutched in his hand, the 70-year-old man who had just casually strolled into a classified control room during a DEFCON 1 meltdown. "This terminal is highly classified. How the hell did you get past the doors? This is a restricted zone." Antonio stared dead into his eyes for one heavy second. "I carry the master keycard for the entire facility," he replied, his voice never shifting from that dead calm frequency. "I'm the night watchman. The night watchman has absolutely no business being on this floor." Marcus pushed back from his chair, his body language aggressively telegraphing that he was ready to physically block the console if he had to. "Get out right now before I have security drag you out." The altercation had finally drawn eyes. Marcus's sudden aggressive movement had broadcasted a shockwave that ripped the attention of the analysts at the neighboring desks away from their dying screens. On the other side of the war room, Raphael dragged his hollow eyes away from the bleeding financial ticker and locked onto the scene, his face twisting into a scowl that took a full second to mutate into recognition. "You?" Raphael's voice carried that specific ugly tone of a guy identifying a piece of trash he thought he threw away, aggressively struggling to compute why that piece of trash was currently standing in his multi-million-dollar control room. The cripple. "What the hell do you think you're doing in here?" Antonio slowly rotated the black notebook and held the open page up, dead center in Marcus's line of sight. Drawn on that page was an architectural schematic that was absolutely, undeniably not the fifth-grade math Raphael had sneered at in the hallway weeks ago. It was a flawless, masterclass dependency map of the legacy kernel, mapping the brutal logic gates between the core modules, isolating the exact integration points where the ancient code was forced to talk to the modern tracking systems, and dead center in the map, circled heavily in red ink that had dried 6 weeks ago, was the exact point of catastrophic failure, with a surgically precise, micro-printed explanation written next to it, and the 3-line patch solution written directly below that. Marcus stared at the page. He stared at it for substantially longer than he intended to. You could physically see the violent recalibration happening in the lead engineer's face, the agonizing, ego-crushing process of a highly paid expert recognizing absolute, God-tier competence in a place he had been aggressively trained his entire life never to look for it. Not on a LinkedIn profile, not on a platinum keycard, not wearing an Armani suit or holding a VP title, but hand-drawn on the lined paper of a cheap notebook, held by the calloused hands of a 70-year-old security guard with a bad leg, who had been brutally silenced the only time he ever tried to warn them. The red numbers on the side monitor kept ticking upward. The fleet was still drifting blind in the dark, and Antonio stood perfectly still with the notebook held steady, armed with the terrifying patience of a man who had waited 6 weeks and could easily afford to wait another 10 seconds. Raphael let out a bark of laughter. It wasn't genuine laughter. It wasn't the sound of a guy who just heard a joke. It was the frantic, toxic, barking laugh that arrogant men use as an exhaust valve when a situation suddenly outgrows their ability to control it, and the ego desperately deploys mockery as the only defense against a total psychological collapse. It was a laugh dripping with raw fear, the humiliation of his own impotence, and the violent need to project that humiliation onto a weaker target before it consumed him. "The rent-a-cop is a software engineer now." His voice carried that loud, performative sneer that desperately requires an audience. He wasn't talking to Antonio. He was broadcasting to the room, to the paralyzed analysts, desperately trying to reassert his dominance in a space where his authority was suddenly, terrifyingly threatened by the possibility that the old man holding the notebook actually possessed the silver bullet they couldn't find. "Go back to scrubbing the lobby floor, cripple. You don't belong in the same room as these systems." 2 heavy-set security guards, who had been locked down at the main entrance since the red alert dropped, moved across the room toward Antonio with that blank, mechanical stride of guys who are just executing an order and taking absolutely no sides, their bodies just following the protocol the boss just barked. Antonio watched them close the distance. There was absolutely no rage on his face, none of the screaming, righteous indignation that the atrocity of that moment demanded, and that anyone with less experience surviving that kind of abuse would have violently displayed. There was only that chilling, armored expression he had forged over 70 years of colliding with a world that constantly reminded him that the elite believed they could treat him like garbage. The dead calm look of a man who is strategically conserving his energy for the kill shot he knows is coming later. He carefully closed the notebook. He tucked it back into his inside pocket. He allowed the guards to physically escort him out of the glass-walled room without a single ounce of resistance, carrying himself with the untouchable dignity of a man who understands that his worth isn't dictated by the room he's standing in, or the hands currently shoving him out the door. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind Antonio. Inside, the control room instantly plunged back into the same frantic chaos that had defined it before he walked in. But the atmospheric pressure had fundamentally mutated, injected with a new, heavy frequency that was impossible to ignore. Marcus had dropped back into his chair, his face a tight mask of a guy aggressively trying to process the schematic he had stared at for way too long. The junior analysts hammered their keyboards. Raphael locked his hollow eyes back onto the hemorrhaging financial ticker. But something lethal had walked into that room with Antonio, and it absolutely did not walk out when he left. The hypothesis. Marcus was staring dead at his monitor, his brain violently splitting its processing power. Half of it desperately trying to hack the crash loop that had owned him for 90 minutes, and the other half obsessively reverse engineering the hand-drawn schematic he had just seen. That image was burned into his retinas, a ghost in the machine that his logical brain hadn't been allowed to fully dissect because corporate protocol had violently interrupted the diagnosis. The dead weight integer, the fifth-generation container ships. The math was singing to him, not a confirmed kill, not the absolute certainty required to push a patch, but it carried that terrifying electric resonance that a flawless hypothesis radiates right before it's proven true. Marcus aggressively ripped open the raw kernel crash log. He ran a targeted search for the exact variable Antonio had called out. He hit the line. He froze, staring at the raw values. The hard-coded ceiling that the legacy kernel had been engineered to process was a maximum threshold established 40 years ago, back when the global fleet was comprised of a specific, lighter class of freighter. The massive, super-heavy Gen 5 container ships had only been integrated into the logistics grid over the last 36 months. The catastrophic difference in displacement tonnage between the legacy ships and the Gen 5s was so massive that, under a scenario of simultaneous maximum capacity loads across multiple new vessels, which was exactly the nightmare scenario playing out tonight, driven by the specific cargo manifests the ships were hauling, the raw data value of the deadweight variable violently ruptured the absolute maximum ceiling of the hard-coded integer. When a variable violently blows past the maximum limit of its programmed container, inside a 40-year-old kernel written in an archaic language that possessed absolutely zero modern error-handling subroutines, the process doesn't throw a polite exception error. The process detonates. Marcus didn't breathe for a full second. Then he pushed his chair back and walked straight up to Raphael. The night watchman's hypothesis might be a confirmed kill, he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register of a man delivering news he knows is going to cause an earthquake. The deadweight integer has completely ruptured the programmed threshold. I need a few more minutes to run the diagnostics and confirm the patch, but I do not want to hear this garbage right now. Raphael's voice had entirely lost the arrogant, barking laugh from earlier, crashing into a brittle, exhausted territory, the sound of a guy who had spent the last 3 hours redlining under a level of pressure. His body was actively starting to reject. Fix the goddamn system. Do not talk to me about a security guard's insane conspiracy theory. Marcus walked back to his console, and the hours bled out. At exactly 2 a.m., the first vessel officially declared a critical fuel emergency. It was a massive bulk freighter drifting in the North Pacific, originally bound for Tokyo when the grid died. It had slammed into autonomous emergency mode and dropped anchor to hold its coordinates, but fighting the ocean currents to maintain a static position while running the massive engines at idle burned heavy fuel. And its tanks had finally dropped below the red line threshold that automatically triggers a priority Mayday burst. The comms analyst caught the transmission and shouted the report across the room, his voice carrying that specific jagged edge that isn't quite blind panic, but is the exact frequency right before it. 20 minutes later, the second hammer dropped. This one was different. It was the specialized refrigerated transport ship that had launched out of Chile 3 days ago, hauling thousands of tons of deep-frozen poultry, locked into a massive multi-million-dollar contract with Asian distributors that had taken an entire fiscal quarter to negotiate. The massive refrigeration units cooling the containers drew their power directly from the ship's auxiliary turbines, and those turbines had been forcefully throttled down into survival economy mode the second the primary navigation system died. The ambient temperature inside the holds had already started the slow, lethal climb. The telemetry report was a death sentence. Estimated time until the internal temperature breaches the absolute safety limit for frozen cargo was exactly 4 hours. 4 hours. Raphael took the report standing up, his phone still gripped in a white-knuckle fist, and he stood perfectly still for a long, agonizing minute, where the English language completely failed to offer him any words. Then he slowly collapsed into the nearest rolling chair. Not the CEO's chair at the center of the room, just a random cheap analyst chair that happened to be close by, and he buried his face in his hands for the second time that night. But this time, the gesture carried a radically different weight. It wasn't the frantic, operational panic of the initial crash. It was the heavy, suffocating gravity of a man who is no longer just calculating the financial slaughter, but calculating the total annihilation of the legacy he carried. He was running the math on what this bloodbath meant for the name stitched on the building, for the father who had built that name into a weapon, for the terrifying conversation that was going to happen when the sun came up and his phone rang with the private number he knew only called when the world was ending. He started to cry, not theatrically. It started with that violent, involuntary shudder in the shoulders that precedes tears in men who have been aggressively conditioned to believe that crying is a fatal weakness. Men who fight the breakdown until the sheer effort of fighting costs more than the tears themselves. The crying came out silent, aimed at the floor, totally invisible to the rest of the room because his face was sealed behind his palms. Outside the glass walls, sitting on a bench in the hallway about 30 feet from the door, was Antonio. He had stayed right there after being physically thrown out. He hadn't gone home, not because he was waiting for an apology, and definitely not because he was hovering to deliver a smug, "I told you so." He stayed because there was a catastrophic emergency actively destroying lives on the other side of that glass, and tucked inside the breast pocket of his faded khaki uniform was the absolute cure for that emergency. And walking out the front door with the cure in his pocket, just because his feelings got hurt, was something Antonio's soul simply would not allow him to do. The black notebook was open on his lap. He had been writing non-stop, not rewriting the diagnostic notes from before, but aggressively expanding the kill chain, running the hardcore calculus required to build out the actual recovery procedure with the brutal level of detail the apocalypse demanded. He had been hard-coding the exact parameters of the ruptured variable that needed to be patched, engineering the exact sequence of commands required to expand the integer ceiling without throwing the booting process into a fatal loop, and designing the highly specific reactivation protocol that would allow the mainframe to handshake with the fleet in a staggered sequence. Because if they tried to sync all 500 ships at the exact same millisecond, the massive data spike would instantly trigger a secondary crash. It was a masterclass architecture that demanded the lethal combination of theoretical genius and boots-on-the-ground reality that Antonio had stockpiled over decades. The theoretical mastery of predictive logistics models that had defined his entire career before the accident, fused perfectly with the practical, granular knowledge of spending 4 years in the dark, watching the company's servers bleed and crash, paying attention with the focus of a man who never lost his genius just because he lost his corner office. The screaming bled through the glass walls, not words. The ambient volume of the control room had violently spiked in a way that broadcasted total escalation without needing a translation. Antonio dragged his eyes up from the notebook. He stared through the glass into the war room. He watched the comms analyst reading the refrigerated cargo report out loud. He didn't hear the words, but he read the sheer terror on the kid's face. He read the horrified reactions of the engineers, and he watched Raphael completely break down. 4 hours left. Antonio snapped the notebook shut, holding his finger on the page to keep his place. He sat frozen on the bench for 1 ticking second. Then he pushed himself up, fighting the familiar grinding resistance of 70 years, and a knee that refused to bend, moving with that calculated efficiency of a guy who doesn't waste energy complaining about the pain. And he marched straight toward the glass doors. This time, there was absolutely zero hesitation on the approach. The decision had been finalized in the hallway, completely bypassing any need for permission from the people inside the room. He pushed the heavy glass door open. The 2 security guards, who had resumed their posts by the entrance, instantly took a synchronized step toward him to block the path. Antonio didn't slow down. He walked straight through the gap between them, radiating a terrifying, absolute calm that wasn't a challenge but a declaration. The dead calm of a man who had weighed the cost of getting arrested against the cost of letting the fleet die, and decided the price of admission was cheap. The guards hesitated, their programming freezing up, because there was something so dominant and undeniable in the way he moved forward without a trace of aggression, that it made physically tackling an old man feel like a dangerous escalation. They absolutely did not have the authority to trigger. Antonio walked straight to an empty terminal desk on the far left flank of the room. He sat down. He placed the black notebook flat on the desk with his usual meticulous care. He pulled a pencil from his breast pocket, a cheap, generic pencil sharpened to a lethal point with a pocket knife. The pink eraser chewed down to the metal band from heavy use. He flipped the notebook open to the exact page he had marked, and he started writing. The control room warped into a highly surreal state around him. The screaming chaos had suddenly collided with a totally immovable object that refused to participate in the panic, creating a bizarre disruption in the room's energy, like a massive boulder sitting dead center in a raging river, forcing the water to break around it. The analysts kept frantically typing, kept shouting updates, kept running the exact same useless diagnostic loops that had failed them for the last 3 hours. But eyes started drifting toward the old man. There was a radioactive quality to Antonio's focus as he hunched over the notebook that was impossible to ignore from across the room. Not the sweating, agonizing concentration of a guy struggling to solve a math problem, but the terrifying, fluid concentration of the zone. The flow state where the brain and the hand holding the pencil merge into a single devastating instrument, and the burning room around him ceases to exist as anything other than background noise. It was the flow of a master operating at the absolute zenith of his capability, completely devoid of the rust you would expect from a guy who hadn't flexed those muscles in years. The pencil tore across the paper in a relentless, aggressive rhythm. Scribble, pause, calculate, scribble. That wasn't fueled by the frantic speed of panic, but was actually infinitely faster than panic, because it was the speed of a man who didn't have to search for the path in the dark. The path was lit up like a runway in his head. Raphael had dragged his wet face out of his hands. He had watched Antonio breach the door. He had watched his own security guards back down. He had watched the old man commandeer a desk and open the book. And he just sat there, staring at the faded khaki uniform for a long, agonizing minute, his face contorted in the painful expression of a man whose ego is desperately trying to reject a truth his logical brain is screaming at him to accept. A man slowly realizing that the exhaustion, the terror, and the 4-hour death clock ticking on the refrigerated cargo were making his arrogance way too expensive to maintain. The pencil kept moving. The pencil didn't stop. There was something hypnotic and terrifying about the relentless scrape of graphite on paper. Not the erratic scribbling of a desperate man, but the unbroken lethal cadence of a genius operating in a frequency where conception and execution happen simultaneously, where there is zero lag between the idea forming and the hand writing it down. Because he had run these exact physics in his head so many thousands of times, the math had become instinct. Antonio wasn't even looking at the digital monitors. He had snatched a crumpled printout off a neighboring desk, the hard copy fleet manifest that had been generated at the start of the shift, hours before the apocalypse hit, listing the exact GPS coordinates, fuel states, and cargo configurations of every active vessel. A piece of dead tree paper carrying the analog ghost of a system that had stopped being analog 30 years ago. Nobody in that room of prodigies had even glanced at that piece of paper since the monitors went red, because the modern tech brain is aggressively conditioned to stare at the black screen and pray it turns back on, instead of looking at the paper backup. Antonio's eyes darted violently between the manifest and the notebook, running a massive, non-linear calculation. The staggering, multi-threaded processing of a brain that can look at a ship's static GPS coordinate and simultaneously calculate its drift rate, its remaining fuel burn, the critical priority of its cargo, and the exact window of time remaining before the fuel died or the cargo rotted. 50 massive ships drifting in the Pacific, each one carrying highly specific coordinates, a highly specific cargo load, a specific fuel burn rate, and a specific original destination. The apocalyptic route optimization nightmare that had literally blown the brain out of the billion-dollar mainframe, the math problem that had locked the greatest young engineers in the country in a death spiral for 3 hours, was being systematically dismantled by hand, with a cheap pencil inside a cheap notebook, on a folding desk in the middle of a war zone. It wasn't magic. It was decades of blood. It was the terrifying difference between knowing maritime logistics because you read a textbook, and knowing it because the math has lived inside your skull for 40 years, because you have stared into the abyss of supply chain optimization for so long, that the abstract patterns dissolve into pure, lethal instinct. Not blind guessing, but weaponized instinct, which is the absolute highest form knowledge can take when it is forged in the fire for long enough. Antonio was running the emergency refueling coordinates, using the exact same underlying logic engine he had used decades ago to draft the original predictive models he had handed to the founder of this very company on a legal pad, on a Tuesday afternoon that was burned into his memory with the crystal clarity of moments that permanently alter the universe. The variables were different now, the ships were monsters, the distances were stretched, the fleet composition was alien, but the foundational physics of the math was exactly the same. It was his math. Pages were filled. The control room kept boiling with the toxic chaos that had defined the entire night, but the frequency of that chaos had fundamentally shifted. An analyst would stare at Antonio's desk, and then another, and then three more. Marcus had desperately thrown 2 more Hail Mary patches at the dead colonel, and watched them both burn. And there was something in the soul-crushing exhaustion of repeated failure that forces a man's eyes to be brutally honest about what they are looking at. Then, Antonio stood up. He stood with that heavy, deliberate motion that had learned to be efficient, without ever hiding the fact that it hurt. Planting his bad right leg with the exact timing required to handle the load, his entire skeleton groaning, but organizing itself upright with the practiced grit of a guy who had fought this exact battle every morning for 20 years. He walked straight to Marcus. He violently tore the page out of the notebook, executing a clean, perfect rip along the spiral binding, leaving 0 jagged edges, the careful precision of a man who respects the work he just created. He held the page out to the lead engineer with the dead calm simplicity of a guy handing over a loaded gun, trusting it to fire. Here. One single word to introduce the payload because the math didn't need a hype man. The override routing for all 50 vessels in the Pacific. Marcus took the paper. The look that hijacked Marcus's face over the next 10 seconds was the agonizing, beautiful process of a brilliant engineer actively authenticating a masterpiece he didn't build. Not skimming it to find flaws to protect his ego, but reading it with the wide-open, terrified respect of a guy who just abandoned his pride because the last 3 hours of hell had made pride too expensive to keep. The architecture was laid out on the page with the blinding clarity of true genius. Not the clarity of a simple idea, but the terrifying clarity of a mind that has drilled so far through the complexity that it broke out the other side and found the single, elegant thread connecting the entire universe. The ships hauling the critical payloads, the biopharma, the frozen meats, the live cargo, had been aggressively mapped to the port of Manzanillo, which sat perfectly inside the navigable fuel radius of those specific vessels. The heavy bulk freighters and the dry goods transports, holding a wider margin of survival, were routed straight to Long Beach. And in the massive, deadly dead zones between the dying ships and the ports was a solution Marcus hadn't even considered in his wildest panic dreams. The auxiliary tanker fleet, currently anchored in maintenance holding patterns across the Pacific, were activated and weaponized as mobile, deep-water refueling stations at the exact GPS coordinates Antonio had mapped out, instantly creating a massive safety net that caught every single ship that didn't have the fuel to make port. It was hard coordinates. It was arrival timestamps. It was staggered approach vectors specifically engineered to prevent a traffic jam at the mobile pumps. It was a flawless, airtight ecosystem. This, Marcus choked. He hesitated, slamming into the realization that he was looking at something infinitely bigger than a patch. This is absolute genius. His eyes ripped across the page again, locking onto a highly specific algorithm, running the math in his head and realizing it was bulletproof. It's mathematically perfect. That last sentence slipped out of Marcus's mouth significantly louder than he intended. What the hell is that old man still doing in my control room? Raphael's voice cracked like a whip from behind them, loaded with that toxic, brittle cruelty that only surfaces when a man is utterly exhausted and terrified. Using rage as the path of least resistance because his brain has no other coping mechanism left. He stalked across the room toward Marcus, his eyes glaring daggers at the security guard. His face twisted in the furious mask of a prince who realizes his orders were ignored. Marcus slowly turned to face him, and he shoved the torn notebook page directly into Raphael's chest. He fixed it, sir. The lead engineer's voice had dropped into that ice-cold, dangerous register of absolute honesty that refuses to ask for permission, the tone that takes over when the truth is way too massive to be buried by corporate politics. In 20 minutes, the architecture on this piece of paper, he took a breath that was, in itself, a hammer blow, is a routing algorithm that would take our quantum supercomputer 3 hours to generate. Maybe longer. Based entirely on the analog data we have right now. Raphael snatched the paper. He stared at it with the panicked eyes of a guy desperately trying to translate a foreign language he only knows a few words of. Recognizing the basic variables, but totally failing to comprehend the genius of the synthesis. Then he slowly dragged his eyes up and locked them onto Antonio. Antonio was standing 6 feet away, holding the black notebook at his side, wearing the exact same expression he had worn since the sun went down. Dead calm, calculating, completely immune to the panic. But there was a new, terrifying gravity in the way he held himself, a primal dominance that had been there the entire time, but the faded uniform, the limp, and the bench in the hallway had acted like camouflage. The camouflage had just burned off. "Son." The voice that rolled out of his chest wasn't the quiet, respectful tone he had used with the security guards, and it wasn't the voice of the guy walking the night shift. It was an infinitely older, heavier voice. The voice of a titan who had kept this specific frequency locked in a vault for 2 decades, waiting for the exact right moment to unleash it. And the moment had arrived. 40 years ago, your grandfather asked me to step into this exact office. Raphael stopped breathing. He slid a pen and a legal pad across the desk. A suffocating pause that carried the crushing weight of 40 years, compressed into a single heartbeat. And I mapped out the predictive logistics theory that built this entire goddamn empire. The silence in the war room mutated into something entirely new. It was the terrifying electric silence of collective realization. 30 people, actively listening to a ghost story that was violently rewriting the entire history of the company they worked for. The master algorithm you kids are running today, the 40-year-old legacy kernel that just blew its brains out tonight, is just a digitized clone of my original handwritten math. Antonio stared dead into Raphael's eyes with a look that had seen way too much blood to care about volume or aggressive gestures. The architecture buried deep in the bedrock of your servers is the exact architecture I wrote in this building. On an afternoon when your grandfather actually believed that a legal pad and a killer idea could change the world. Raphael was still gripping the piece of paper, but he had completely stopped looking at it. I was the chief architect. The words hit the room with the lethal precision of bullets that had been saved for 20 years, just for this specific target. Until a brutal war with the board of directors over the future of the fleet cost me my title, a heavy pause, and my right leg, in a horrific car accident that magically happened 3 weeks after I was terminated, in a vehicle that had run flawlessly until that exact night. The bad right leg, the heavy limp, the faded khaki uniform. Your father handed me this security badge years later. His voice dropped into a quieter, deadlier register. Not weaker, but quieter the way an assassin is quiet right before the kill. As a pathetic charity case, to keep a roof over my head. And to keep me locked in a cage where he could keep an eye on me. Where I would be forced to walk these halls every single night and look at the empire I built, as a permanent reminder of what they took from me. Raphael's face was a portrait of total, structural collapse, watching the mythological history of his family's company get violently torn to shreds in real time. The history he had arrogantly strutted through for years, completely blind to the bodies buried under the floorboards because he never had to look down. The man he called a cripple, the notebook he called 5th grade math, the car accident that wasn't an accident, and the genius logistics theory that built the world, the exact theory currently rotting inside the dead mainframe, the exact theory written on the paper trembling in Raphael's hand, the exact theory that had just been flawlessly rebuilt by hand, in pencil, inside a dirty notebook, while the highest-paid prodigies in the country crashed and burned, using million-dollar hardware. Antonio slowly slid the black notebook back into the breast pocket of his uniform with his usual, meticulous care. He waited. Raphael didn't say a word. There is a highly specific, terrifying moment in a man's life when a truth so massive and so radioactive slams into his brain that the central nervous system just pulls the plug, exactly like a server crashing from a data overload. And Raphael was trapped in that crash, holding the paper, staring at Antonio. while the entire control room suffocated in the kind of silence that only happens when a bell is rung that can never be unrung. The truth had detonated in every single ear in the room. The original logistics theory, the chief architect, the highly suspicious car crash, every single analyst, every single engineer, every single soul in that room had heard the confession, and their brains were ruthlessly running the math. The terrifying math that linked the old man in the cheap uniform to the core of the dead server, that linked the black notebook to the bleeding fleet, that linked the ruined leg to a boardroom war and a dark highway 20 years ago. And then they ran the second equation. The math that linked this absolute titan to the arrogant, screaming heir, who had called him a cripple and a moron in the hallway 3 weeks ago, wielding the lazy, sadistic cruelty of a predator who believes he has a God-given right to destroy the weak for free. The eyes that slowly rotated to lock onto Raphael in that moment were not the subservient, terrified eyes of employees looking at the boss's son. They were the cold, judging eyes of a jury that had just seen the murder weapon, and the verdict was permanent. The arrogance, the bulletproof, diamond-encrusted swagger that had been Raphael's entire personality since the day he was born. The armor forged from 30 years of being the heir to the throne. The yachts, the designer suits, the absolute certainty that he owned every room he walked into, evaporated. It wasn't a slow leak. It was the instantaneous, violent vacuum that happens when a delusion is popped by reality. What was left shivering in the center of the room was a 30-year-old kid who suddenly looked like a terrified teenager, radiating that highly specific, gut-rotting shame that isn't just the embarrassment of getting owned in public, but the agonizing, soul-crushing horror of realizing that the monstrous things you said and did actually happened in the real world, and you can never, ever take them back. He started to stammer. I had no idea. His voice had completely lost its bass, stripped of all the executive coaching and power dynamics, exposing the raw, frantic frequency of a terrified kid desperately searching for a lifeline. My father never told me the truth. He never said a word about you, about the models, about... He choked, tried again. Please, sir, will you please help us deploy this patch? I will give you a blank check, a seat on the board, millions, a mansion. Name your price, whatever you want. The bribe spilled out of his mouth with the chaotic, panicked urgency of a guy desperately trying to buy his way out of an apocalypse he doesn't understand, using the only ammunition he was ever taught to use, money, titles, power, because his father never bothered to teach him anything else. Antonio stared at him for a long, heavy beat. The look on the old watchman's face wasn't rage. It was infinitely worse than rage, in the way that absolute superiority is worse. It was pity. The devastating clinical pity of a man looking at an enemy and seeing a pathetic, broken product of bad parenting. A man looking at a kid who grew up functionally illiterate in the only things that actually matter, because the billionaires raising him were too busy to teach him how to be a man. You called me a cripple. The words left Antonio's mouth carrying that exact same dead calm, lethal frequency that had defined his entire night. Not the calm of apathy, but the terrifying calm of a judge reading a death sentence. You called me stupid. You violently threw my life's work onto the floor and called it garbage. A pause that stretched across the room, highlighting the massive, bloody distance between the insults in the hallway and the begging happening right now. And you didn't do it because you are some comic book villain. You did it because you were spoon-fed. The delusion that your grandfather's empire, your father's bank account, and your trust fund magically made you a superior species of human being to the people who don't have those things. And nobody in your entire life loved you enough to beat that delusion out of you. Raphael stared at Antonio, paralyzed, wearing the horrified expression of a man being forced to listen to a flawless, surgical autopsy of his own soul, completely unable to deny a single word because he knew it was the absolute truth. I don't want a single dime of your blood money. The words hit like coffin nails, carrying the terminal finality of a decision that was made 2 decades ago and requires absolutely zero debate today. I don't want your VP title. I don't want a single goddamn thing you're offering me, because they are the exact same pathetic bribes your father tried to shove down my throat 20 years ago to buy my silence, to keep me locked in a cage where he could gloat. He turned his body to face Marcus. The lead engineer was standing frozen with the notebook page still clutched in his fists, his face carrying the exhausted, hollowed-out clarity of a man who had spent the last 4 hours fighting a losing war in the dark and had finally been handed the nuclear code. It's the kind of hyper-clarity that only extreme trauma and sleep deprivation can produce, stripping away all the corporate bullshit and leaving nothing but the raw truth. Keep the architecture. The brutal simplicity of those 3 words carried a gravitational weight that no speech could ever match. Deploy the patch. It's on the house. A pause. Consider it a gift to the exhausted kids bleeding on the keyboards in this room tonight, and to every single blue-collar worker in this building who actually looked me in the eye and treated me like a human being when they passed me in the hall. Marcus nodded. There were absolutely no English words adequate for the gravity of the transaction, and Marcus, who was a genius in his own right, was smart enough not to ruin it by trying to speak. He just gave a slow, deep nod, the universal gesture of a soldier accepting a heavy weapon with the absolute respect it demands. Antonio turned and walked toward the glass doors. The heavy limp that had been the punchline of Raphael's cruel joke, the physical scar that the arrogant kid had weaponized to degrade the man's entire existence, that limp carried a radically different, terrifying energy to the 30 people watching him walk away. The limp hadn't changed. The limp felt different because the titan dragging the leg had finally revealed his face. He reached the glass doors. He stopped. There was one final bullet left in the chamber, and it was time to fire it. Not out of a petty need to twist the knife, not for cinematic flair, but because it was the absolute truth, and the truth has a violent, undeniable need to be spoken out loud. He spoke without turning around. About the car crash. His voice drifted back across the room, carrying the exact same dead calm tone, completely devoid of theatrical malice, because a live grenade doesn't need to act scary. The payload is enough. I kept the receipts. I have the signed diagnostic reports from the independent mechanic who inspected the brake lines the week before the wreck. I have hard copies of the buried internal memos that I pulled off the server before I was escorted out of the building. A lethal pause. If your father wants to avoid the kind of federal investigation those documents would detonate, I highly suggest your family leaves me alone for the rest of my natural life. Completely alone. The control room was a vacuum. Raphael was frozen in place, utterly paralyzed by the radioactive shockwave of realizing exactly what he had inherited. An inheritance that went way beyond the yachts, the shipping contracts, and the name on the door. He was inheriting the blood, the corruption, and the bodies his father had buried decades before he was even born. He had enjoyed the spoils of the war his entire life, and he was just now discovering the horrifying price tag attached to the throne. The heavy glass door clicked open. Antonio walked out. He walked down the exact same fluorescent-lit hallway he had patrolled 1,000 times on the graveyard shift, carrying his flashlight, his black notebook, and the familiar rhythm of his bad leg that he had mastered long ago. The overhead lights threw long, shifting shadows across the linoleum tiles he knew by heart, and the suffocating silence of the corridor at 3 a.m. carried that highly specific electric charge of a silence that follows a hurricane. Now I'm asking you, did Antonio make the right call giving them the billion-dollar patch for free and walking away with his soul intact? Or should he have grabbed them by the throat, demanded his throne back, and taken every single dime he was owed? There is no wrong answer. There is only your answer. Drop it in the comments. I want to know exactly what you think. Months later, in a quiet public park a few blocks away from that glass and steel monolith, there was a worn wooden bench sitting under an old oak tree that threw perfect cooling shade when the morning sun crested the skyline. Antonio was sitting on that bench. The faded khaki uniform was gone, replaced by simple, comfortable clothes, the kind of gear a man wears when physical comfort is the only metric he gives a damn about. Clothes that broadcast absolutely nothing, except the fact that the guy wearing them is perfectly at peace with who he is. The pigeons swarming the pavement had learned through sheer repetition to associate the old man with breadcrumbs, and there was that easy transactional peace that exists between wild animals and a guy they know isn't going to hurt them. The black notebook was open on his lap. The pencil was flying across the page with that exact same lethal, aggressive rhythm that had defined the midnight patrols. The rhythm of a genius brain bleeding math onto paper, existing purely because the math demands to exist, completely untethered from job titles, corporate validation, or the permission of arrogant billionaires to be what it is. A little kid wandered over, 4 or 5 years old, carrying that raw, fearless curiosity that kids have for things the adults around them have been conditioned to aggressively ignore. He shuffled up to the bench with the cautious fascination of youth, his eyes locked onto the dense algorithms in the notebook, possessing none of the social programming that tells you not to stare. "What's that?" The voice piped up with that blunt, unfiltered honesty kids use, completely bypassing any social buffer. Antonio stopped writing and looked up. He looked down at the kid with the exact same dead calm, heavy expression he had worn during the apocalypse in the war room. The expression of a man who looks directly into the soul of what is standing in front of him, refusing to judge the book by the cover. "They're numbers, kiddo." A soft pause that held 40 years of war, betrayal, and genius that had finally, sitting on this wooden bench in the morning sun, found the perfect distance to be viewed with absolute peace. "They tell stories." The kid stared at the dense math in the notebook for one more second, giving it that deep, serious consideration kids sometimes give to answers they don't remotely understand, but instinctively know are telling the truth. Then he spun around and sprinted away, fueled by that chaotic child energy, where the first curiosity is satisfied, and the next one is already calling from across the park. Antonio dropped his eyes back to the page. The pencil started moving again, and spreading across his weathered face sitting on that wooden bench under the oak tree, surrounded by pigeons with the black notebook on his lap and the morning sun warming his shoulders, was a smile. It wasn't the arrogant, toxic smirk of a guy who just won a war or destroyed his enemies. It was the rarest, most beautiful smile on earth. The smile of a man who is sitting exactly where he wants to be, doing exactly what he was born to do, and doesn't need a single ounce of permission from a glass and steel skyscraper to be a titan. This story is cold, hard proof that true genius doesn't wear a name tag, and it sure as hell doesn't need a corner office. It is born in the fire before the title, and it survives long after the cowards try to strip it away. That no skyscraper on earth is big enough to lock up a truly brilliant mind. That the cruel, arrogant garbage you spit at people in the hallway doesn't just vanish into thin air. It sets a trap that will eventually snap your neck. And that the ultimate freedom in this world isn't conquering the empire that threw you out. It's realizing you don't need a single damn thing from them to be a king. If you want more stories that rip your heart out and put it back together, smash subscribe and ring the bell to join the crew.